In a war that took the lives of nearly 700,000 to 850,000 people, the Civil War of America is one of the deadliest in the history of mankind. Hello and welcome to UPSC History View. Today, let's learn about the American Civil War from the year 1862. The year 1862 marked a major turning point in the war, especially the war in the East, as Lee took command of the Confederate Army, which he promptly renamed the Army of Northern Virginia. With Lee's ascent, the Army of the Potomac found itself repeatedly battered. While the Army of the Potomac was beleaguered by less than visionary leadership, Union forces in the West experienced far greater success under more aggressive generals. Paradoxically, Lee kept the Confederate war effort going long enough for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which struck at the very institution the South had gone to war to protect. Let's take a look at the war in the East. Fresh from his victories in Western Virginia, McClellan was called to Washington to replace Scott. There he began to mold the Army of the Potomac into a resolute, effective shield and sword of the Union. But personality clashes and unrelenting opposition to McClellan from the radical Republicans in Congress hampered the sometimes tactless general who was a Democrat. It took time to drill, discipline, and equip this force of considerably more than 100,000 men. But as fall blended into winter, loud demands arose that McClellan advance against Johnston's Confederate forces at Centerville and Manassas in Virginia. McClellan fell seriously ill with typhoid fever in December, and when he had recovered weeks later, he found that Lincoln, desperately eager for action, had ordered him to advance on February 22, 1862. Long debates ensued between president and commander. These disagreements led the obstreperous and bulky McClellan to make statements and take actions that would have been and indeed were considered insubordinate by almost anyone other than the extremely patient Lincoln. When in March, McClellan finally began his peninsular campaign, he discovered that Lincoln at Stanton had withheld large numbers of his command in front of Washington for the defense of the capital, forces that actually were not needed there. Upon taking command of the army in the field, McClellan was relieved of his duties as General-in-Chief. Let's learn about the Peninsular Campaign. Advancing up the historic peninsula between the York and James rivers in Virginia, McClellan began a month-long siege of Yorktown and captured the stronghold on May 4, 1862. A Confederate rearguard action at Williamsburg the next day delayed the Blueclads, who then slowly moved up through heavy rain to within 4 miles of Richmond in Virginia. Striving to seize the initiative, Johnston attacked McClellan's left wing at Seven Pines on May 31st, and after scoring initial gains was checked. Johnston was severely wounded, and in a major, though often overlooked development of the war, Lee, who had been serving as Davis's military advisor, succeeded him. Lee promptly renamed the command the Army of Northern Virginia. McClellan counterattacked on June 1st and forced the Southerners back into the environs of Richmond. The Federals suffered a total of 5,031 casualties out of a force of nearly 100,000, while the Confederates lost 6,134 of about 74,000 men. As McClellan inched forward toward Richmond in June, Lee prepared a counterstroke. He recalled from the Shenandoah Valley Jackson's forces, which had threatened Harper's Ferry and had brilliantly defeated several scattered Federal armies, and with about 90,000 soldiers, attacked McClellan on June 26 to begin the fighting of the 7 days battles. In the ensuing days at Mechanicsville, Gaines Mill, Savage's Station, Fraser's Farm, and Malvern Hill, Lee tried unsuccessfully to crush the Army of the Potomac. which McClellan was moving to another base on the James River. But the Confederate commander had at least saved Richmond. McClellan inflicted 20,614 casualties on Lee while suffering 15,849 himself. McClellan felt that he could not move upon Richmond without considerable reinforcement, and his estimates of the men he needed went up and up and up. Against his protest, his army was withdrawn from the peninsula to Washington by Lincoln, and the new General-in-Chief, Halleck, a man McClellan scornfully considered to be his inferior. Many of McClellan's units were given to a new Federal Army commander, John Pope, who was directed to move overland against Richmond. Let's take a look at the Second Battle of the Bull Run and Antietam. Pope advanced confidently towards the Rappahannock River with his army of Virginia, while Lee, once McClellan had been pulled back from near Richmond, moved northward to confront Pope before he could be joined by all of McClellan's troops. Daringly splitting his army, Lee sent Jackson to destroy Pope's base at Manassas, while he himself advanced via another route with James Longstreet's half of the army. Pope opened the Second Battle of Bull Run on August 29th with heavy but futile attacks on Jackson. The next day, Lee arrived and crushed the Federal left with a massive flank assaulted by Longstreet, which combined with Jackson's counterattacks drove the Northerners back en route upon Washington. Pope lost 13,824 men out of force of about 70,000, while Lee lost 8,353 out of about 55,000. With the Federal soldiers now lacking confidence in Pope, Lincoln relieved him and merged his forces into McClellan's Army of the Potomac. Lee followed up his advantage with his first invasion of the North, pushing as far as Frederick, Maryland. His hope was to bring Maryland into the Confederacy. Maryland was a slave state that had remained in the Union. Lee also felt that if he could continue to grind down civilian will on the Union side, the North would grant the Confederacy its independence. McClellan had to reorganize his army on the march, a task that he performed capably. But McClellan could not overcome his own worst impulses. He overestimated the size of Lee's army by a factor of about 2.5. Worse, he failed to capitalize on an astonishing stroke of luck, the capture of Lee's orders, discovered on the ground wrapped around 3 cigars. Rather than striking immediately against Lee's scattered forces, McClellan waited 18 hours before moving. Finally, McClellan pressed forward and wrested the initiative from Lee by attacking and defeating a Confederate force at 3 gaps of the South Mountain between Frederick and Hagerstown on September 14th. Lee fell back into a cramped defensive position along Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland, where he was reinforced by Jackson, who had just captured about 12,000 Federals at Harper's Ferry. After yet another delay, McClellan struck the Confederates on September 17th in the bloodiest day of the war. Although gaining some ground, the Federals were unable to drive the Confederate army into the Potomac, but Lee was compelled to retreat back into Virginia. At Antietam, McClellan lost 12,401 of some 87,000 engaged, while Lee lost 10,316 of perhaps 45,000. When McClellan did not pursue Lee as quickly as Lincoln and Halleck thought he should, he was replaced in command by Ambrose E. Burnside, an acolyte of McClellan who had been an ineffective corps commander at Antietam. Let's learn about the battle at Fredericksburg. Burnside delayed for a number of weeks before marching his reinforced army of 120,281 men to a point across the Rappahannock River from Fredericksburg, Virginia. On December 13th, he ordered a series of 16 hopeless piecemeal frontal assaults across open ground against Lee's army of 78,513 troops, drawn up in an impregnable position atop high ground and behind a stone wall. The Federals were repelled with staggering losses. Burnside lost 12,653 men compared with Lee's 5,309. "If there is a worse place than hell, I am in it," Lincoln reportedly said. Morale in the Army of the Potomac fell further in January when Burnside ordered a flanking maneuver against rebel forces. After an auspicious start to the march on January 20th, 1863, a driving rain began that night. The Yankees quickly bogged down in what became known as the Mud March. Burnside turned back on January 23rd as Federal confidence plunged, desertions rose. On January 25, 1863, Abraham Lincoln replaced Burnside with the proficient corps commander Joseph Hooker, who was a harsh critic of other generals and even of the president. Both armies went into winter quarters near Fredericksburg. Let's learn about the Emancipation Proclamation. Despite its shocking casualty figures, the most important consequence of Antietam was off the field. From the outset of the war, slaves had been pouring into Federal camps seeking safety and freedom. Early in the war, Abraham Lincoln had slapped the wrists of commanders who tried to issue emancipation edicts in areas under their control. Trying to balance political and military necessity against moral imperatives, Abraham Lincoln believed that keeping the slave-owning border states Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and particularly Kentucky in the Union was critical, and that making any move toward freeing slaves could incite those states to secede. Moreover, the Constitution protected slavery in several ways, most importantly through its defense of property rights. Finally, Lincoln believed for the first year or so of the war that a significant number of Unionists existed in the seceded states, and that, given time, those people would rise up and revolt against the Confederate government. As early as August 1861, though, slaveholders' claims to property rights had begun to erode when Congress passed its first Confiscation Act, which allowed Union troops to seize rebels' property, including slaves who fought with or worked for the Confederate military. One Union general, Benjamin Butler, a prominent attorney and politician in civilian life, read up on military law and used confiscation laws to the Union's benefit by turning the slave owner's claim to property rights on its head. Armies had always been able to confiscate property of military value, Butler argued, and slaves were instrumental in supporting the Confederate cause. With so many slaves manning factories and working fields, about 80% of eligible white Southern men wound up serving in the military. Butler declared slaves who came into his lines to be contrabands of war and therefore not liable for return to their masters. The name contrabands was used for the remainder of the war to describe slaves who ran from their masters to the Union Army. In April 1862, Congress abolished slavery in the District of Columbia and paid owners in the district about $300 on average for each slave. 3 months later, Congress passed the Second Confiscation Act, which mandated that any Confederate civilian or military official who did not surrender within 60 days would have his slaves freed. 2 days after that, Congress banned slavery from the territories. Abraham Lincoln, meanwhile, was meeting with men from the border states, especially Kentucky, hoping to persuade them to agree to a compensated emancipation. Over the course of these encounters, it became clear to him that the broad Unionist sentiment he thought existed in the South was a chimera. When talks with the Kentucky delegates broke off in July, Abraham Lincoln immediately sat down and drafted the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. In its final form, the Emancipation Proclamation would free the slaves in areas that were not under Union control as of January 1, 1863, when it went into effect. This meant it did not apply in the border states or places such as New Orleans, which were already under Union military occupation by that time. Lincoln realized that such a move would strike a serious blow militarily to the Confederates, who relied on bondsmen for the bulk of their labor during the war, by both demoralizing white Southerners and giving additional incentive to slaves to run away. However, the summer of 1862 had been a bleak one for Federal forces, and Abraham Lincoln did not want to issue the proclamation when the North appeared to be losing. He did not want other countries to consider it an act of desperation. So he put the document in his desk drawer and waited for a victory. Antietam, while technically a draw, was close enough that Lincoln claimed it as a Union win and announced the proclamation. This was an important turning point. The war was now a contest not just about saving the Union, but also about freeing 4 million bondsmen and bondswomen. This new moral element to the war persuaded the British and French to stay out of the conflict and to never offer the Confederates the diplomatic recognition they desperately sought. Let's take a look at the African American troops. The Emancipation Proclamation also allowed black men to serve in the Union Army. This had been illegal under a federal law enacted in 1792. With their stake in the Civil War now patently obvious, African Americans joined the service in significant numbers. By the end of the war, about 180,000 African Americans were in the army, which amounted to about 10% of the troops in that branch, and another 20,000 were serving in the Navy. Still, military service did not erase the bigotry that characterized Northern society at the time. African American soldiers were placed in segregated units, few of which saw action in battle, and their regiments were commanded by white men. Only a handful of African Americans achieved an officer's rank. Most black troops were put on guard duty or asked to build forts. Because they tended to be in camps, these men were at far greater risk of contracting a disease than were troops on the march. As a result, nearly 3/4 of the 40,000 African American soldiers who died in the war succumbed to either disease or infection rather than battle wounds. Initially, black troops were paid significantly less than their white counterparts. White privates made $13 a month and their uniforms were paid for. Blacks earned $10 a month with $3 deducted each month for uniform costs. By June 1864, this had become enough of an embarrassment that Congress deemed that white and black troops should be paid equally and made the action retroactive. African American soldiers were routinely issued equipment that was much older or poorly made in comparison with the equipment their white comrades received. Black soldiers also faced a threat that no white troops faced when they were captured by the rebels. Black troops could be put into slavery whether they had been free or slaves before the proclamation. They also suffered much harsher treatment if they were held as prisoners of war. Despite the many disadvantages under which they labored, black troops who saw battle performed admirably. African Americans participated directly in fights at Milliken's Bend, Louisiana, Port Hudson, Louisiana, Fort Wagner, South Carolina, where the famed 54th Massachusetts Regiment lost 2/3 of its officers and nearly half its enlisted men. They also fought in Petersburg, Virginia, and Nashville, Tennessee. 25 black men were awarded the Medal of Honor for their bravery during the war. Let's take a look at the war in the West. In the Trans-Mississippi Theater and Missouri, covetous Confederate eyes were cast on California, where ports for privateers could be seized, as could gold and silver to buttress a sagging treasury. Led by Henry Sibley, a Confederate force of some 2,600 invaded the Union's Department of New Mexico, where the Federal commander, Edward Canby, had but 3,810 men to defend the entire vast territory. Although plagued by pneumonia and smallpox, Sibley battered a Federal force at Valverde on February 21, 1862, and captured Albuquerque and Santa Fe on March 23. But at the crucial engagement of La Glorieta Pass, a few days later, Sibley was checked and lost most of his wagon train. He had to retreat into Texas, where he reached safety in April, but with only 900 men and 7 of 337 supply wagons left. Further eastward, in the more vital Mississippi Valley, operations were unfolding as large and as important as those on the Atlantic seaboard. Missouri and Kentucky were key border states that Lincoln had to retain within the Union orbit. Commanders there, especially on the Federal side, had greater autonomy than those in Virginia. Affairs began inauspiciously for the Federals in Missouri when Nathaniel Lyon's 5,000 Union troops were defeated at Wilson's Creek on August 10, 1861, by a Confederate force of more than 10,000 under Sterling Price and Benjamin McCulloch, each side losing some 1,200 men. But the Federals under Samuel Curtis decisively set back a gray-clad army under Earl Van Dorn at Pea Ridge, Arkansas on March 7, 1862, saving Missouri for the Union and threatening Arkansas. Let's learn about the operations in Kentucky and Tennessee. The Confederates to the east of Missouri had established a unified command under Albert Sidney Johnston, who manned with only 40,000 men. A long line in Kentucky running from near Cumberland Gap on the east through Bowling Green to Columbus on the Mississippi River. Numerically superior Federal forces cracked this line in early 1862. First, George H. Thomas broke Johnston's right flank at Mill Springs, Kentucky on January 19th. Then, in February, Grant, assisted by Federal gunboats commanded by Andrew H. Foote and acting under Halleck's orders, ruptured the center of the southern line in Kentucky by capturing Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson, 11 miles to the east on the Cumberland River. The Confederates suffered more than 16,000 casualties at the latter stronghold, most of them taken prisoner, against Federal losses of fewer than 3,000. And Grant's victories at Forts Henry and Donelson marked the first real successes for the Union in the war. Johnston's left anchor fell when Pope seized New Madrid, Missouri, and Island No. 10 in the Mississippi River in March and April. This forced Johnston to withdraw his remnants quickly from Kentucky through Tennessee and to reorganize them for a counterstroke. This seemingly impossible task he performed splendidly. The Confederate onslaught came at Shiloh, Tennessee, near Pittsburgh Landing, a point on the west bank of the Tennessee River to which Grant and William T. Sherman had incautiously advanced. In a Herculean effort, Johnston pulled his forces together and with 40,000 men suddenly struck a like number of unsuspecting Federals on April 6th. Johnston hoped to crush Grant before the arrival of Don Carlos Buell's 20,000 Federal troops approaching from Nashville, Tennessee. A desperate combat ensued, with Confederate assaults driving the Federals perilously close to the river. But at the height of success, Johnston was mortally wounded. The southern attack then lost momentum and Grant held on until reinforced by Buell. On the following day, the Federals counterattacked and drove the Confederates, now under Bear Guard, steadily from the field, forcing them to fall back to Corinth in northern Mississippi. Grant's victory cost him 13,047 casualties compared with Southern losses of 10,694. Halleck then assumed personal command of the combined forces of Grant, Buell, and Pope and inched forward to Corinth, which the Confederates had evacuated on May 30th. With this battle and its huge losses, the people of both the Union and the Confederacy came to realize that this war would be longer and costlier than many on either side had thought in 1861. Bear Guard, never popular with Davis, was superseded by Braxton Bragg, one of the president's favorites. Braxton Bragg was an imaginative strategist and an effective drill master and organizer, but he was also a weak tactician and a martinet who was disliked by a number of his principal subordinates. Leaving 22,000 men in Mississippi under Price and Van Dorn, Bragg moved through Chattanooga, Tennessee, with 30,000 troops, hoping to reconquer the state and carry the war into Kentucky. Some 18,000 other Confederate soldiers under E. Kirby Smith were at Knoxville, Tennessee. Buell led his federal force northward to save Louisville, Kentucky, and to force Bragg to fight. Occupying Frankfort, Kentucky, Bragg failed to move promptly against Louisville. In the ensuing Battle of Perryville in October 8th, Bragg, after an early advantage, was halted by Buell and impelled to fall back to a point south of Nashville. Meanwhile, Federals under William S. Rosecrans had checked Price and Van Dorn at Iuka, Mississippi on September 19th and had repelled their attack in the Battle of Corinth on October 3rd. Buell, like McClellan, cautious and a Democrat, was slow in his pursuit of the retreating Confederates, and despite his success at Perryville, was relieved of his command by Abraham Lincoln on October 24th. His successor, Rosecrans, was able to safeguard Nashville and then move southeastward against Bragg's army at Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Rosecrans scored a partial success by bringing on the bloody Battle of Stones River. Again, after first having the better of the combat, Bragg was finally contained and forced to retreat. Of some 41,400 men, Rosecrans lost 12,906, while Bragg suffered 11,739 casualties out of about 34,700 effectives. Although it was a strategic victory for Rosecrans, his army was so shaken that he felt unable to advance again for 5 months, despite the urgings of Lincoln and Halleck. Thank you for listening to this discussion on the American Civil War till 1862. For more such discussions, get the UPSC Practice app from the App Store.